Hello and welcome to the LIVEcast. My name is Glen Scrivener. So glad to have your company. And over in Crowborough in East Sussex, there is also the great Paul Feasy. How are you doing today, Paul?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thanks. Yeah, it's a bit grey and miserable here, but it's all good.
We are with somebody who I am quite certain is experiencing much better weather than we are. Way over in California, we've got Scott Dunford with us. He is the co-host of the excellent podcast, the Missions Podcast. He's also the lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont. Hello, Scott. Tell us, what is the weather like where you are?
Well, the weather in California is kind of boring. It's always sunny here. So I'm
So
actually in
hard.
Northern California, and in the winter, it does feel a little bit like England. But yeah, the weather is beautiful.
Um, this is a lot of waggling on the tee, which is a golf term for people who don't know. As we consider an issue that we began with last week, we tried to shine a little bit of a spotlight onto some of the issues that are happening in Xinjiang province in China, and especially among Uyghur Muslims. And so we reached out to find people who have experience in this area, just so that as Christians we can understand more of what's going on in the world, and so that as concerned believers we can reach out in prayer to God and have an informed prayer life about some of these matters. So Scott Dunford, you were very gracious in offering us your time. Can you tell us a little bit about where your interest in China and perhaps in particular Xinjiang province began?
I was a youth pastor in the Midwest. That's in the state of Wisconsin, or actually in Michigan. I grew up in Wisconsin. We moved to Michigan, and most of the people in Michigan, they're blue collar factory workers, farmers. Don't leave the state a lot, and I had this great vision. I had gone to Bethlehem Baptist Church, and where John Piper, which I'm sure you're familiar with, did such a great job of mobilizing people for mission. So I had this big vision of like, okay, I'm going to get these high school students to think about missions. And after it had been there a few years and gained a little bit of trust, we decided to do something really intrepid and decided to take our youth group and college ministry over to China. And we just to visit some missionaries we knew there, to just get an understanding of what God was doing there and the needs there, and kind of expose our young people to the world. And it was great. The team we worked with, they basically just put us around Chinese people all the time, and those relationships were so important to us understanding. But I had a moment when I was walking in the early morning. Sun comes up very early in Beijing, because this goes into our broader discussion, but China's desire to bring all of China into like one country unified. They have one time zone for a land mass the size of the United States. And so Beijing and Xinjiang both are 8 o'clock in the morning at the same time, even though the sun's up really early in Beijing and then comes up far later in the West. And so it's 4 in the morning, I'm jet lagging, we're walking, and I'm just seeing a sea of people, even at 4 in the morning, as far as I could see, just so many people packing the streets. And it just hit me in a very dramatic way that those people know as much about Christ as I knew at that time about Confucius. And as a believer, that unsettled me, and I couldn't shake it, and came back to the States and just began devouring everything I could read about China. And I began to discover, wow, it's not just the Han Chinese people, but there's all these minority peoples, and some of the people groups are massive, 10, 12 million people in these considered tiny people groups. And one of those people groups that just so I started praying about the people groups, and kind of identified some of the biggest ones that didn't have any gospel witness. And the one that kept coming to my mind, and it probably something just as foolish as like beautiful colors that they wore. I can't speak to like why I kept being drawn to this people group, but I just began focusing my prayer more and more on the Uyghur people. And and as a God kind of got a hold of our hearts, it led us to make some, pretty drastic steps to move our entire family. I got 4 children. At that time, they were very young. Of course, my wife, and we left our ministry in Michigan and moved across the ocean and settled into life in China. So that's kind of how the Lord did it. I mean, it was just one kind of step after another and exploring, and then the Lord kind of got a hold of our hearts as we began learning and studying about these different groups.
What kind of years were you there for?
We came in the Olympics. And so it was 2008, which was a great time to be there. It was chaotic and beautiful and crazy, and also a time of real opening. And if you understand China's history, it's pretty cyclical in some ways, which kind of fits the Eastern mind, in that there's open periods and closed periods. And even in ancient history, you have the Tang Dynasty, in which it was super open. And we think of the Silk Road. It was thrived during the Tang Dynasty, and it thrived during the Han Dynasty. But then you have, these other dynasties, the Song Dynasty, the Qin Dynasty, which things kind of shut down. And that was a time when things were really open, and a lot of things were happening. There's a lot of freedom, a lot of even religious freedom. People were being pretty open and sharing their faith, even in a place like Beijing. But then things began to change, and really seeing kind of an uptick in persecution, an uptick in shutting things down, and then particularly a real harsh focus toward the Uyghur minorities and in Xinjiang province. So we were there kind of during a unique time, but also a time when I think a lot of what we're seeing now started to take place.
What was can you tell us a bit about what it was like? What the people were like there. I mean, tell us a bit. I mean, did you spend some time then with the Uyghur community? Can you give us a sense of what they're like as a people? I mean, we've been hearing stories about Uyghur Muslims. Is it just a Muslim community, or is there more to it than that? Or
so historically, so the Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim people group. And, we tend to think of Turkey as the country of Turkey. But historically, the Turkic peoples really lived in the same areas where the Mongolians are now. And so they were kind of a semi-nomadic people. And as the rise of the Mongol Empire was taking place, the Mongol tribes, even before there was an empire, they began pushing other people groups out of their region. And so the Uyghurs started settling into northern, what we call today northern China, Xinjiang, but also kind of spread out across those steppes. So what we think of today as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. I mean, a lot of those were those Turkic tribes kind of spread across that whole way, all the way really into today modern day Turkey, which obviously we know even from reading the New Testament that wasn't Turkish then. And so these people settled in. They had different religions. Obviously, early they were animistic and practiced tribal religions. They were Manichaean at one point, which is kind of interesting. They eventually got introduced to Nestorian Christianity, and there was a thriving Eastern. When I say Nestorian, there's debate about how Nestorian they really were, but they were referred to as Nestorians. So there was a thriving Christian community amongst the Uyghurs. And then, in the middle, during the rise of the Mongol Empire, around 1400, Islam really began to take a hold in that region. And as one leader after another kind of converted to Islam and brought their people into Islam. And then, of course, you had, some of the Mongol Empire and their influences with Islam. You really saw the whole region become Muslim. And so up to that time, each oases kind of had their own identity. So, in Hotan, they would be Buddhist, but maybe in Kashgar, they're already Muslim. So you have some of these, this emerging kind of Turkic identity, and then a Uyghur identity. And then a religious identity on top of those things. So we became intimately acquainted with the Uyghur people mostly through students. So the city where we were located had a large Muslim quarter, mostly Hui Muslims, which are Chinese speaking and mostly ethnically Chinese Muslims, but have been Muslims for, for centuries. And so it made it easy for Uyghur students to come in. Well, in 2009, there was a very big uprising in the capital city of Xinjiang called Urumqi. And there's obviously huge debate about what really happened. If you talk to the Chinese, they say, Uyghurs went crazy and started slaughtering us, and we had to fight back. But from the Uyghur standpoint, which makes the most sense to me, and my bias is leaning that way, put that clearly on the table, was that there was some Uyghurs that were treated unjustly in another part of China, and they were sentenced to death for a crime that they said they didn't commit. Well, the Uyghurs in Urumqi started demonstrating peacefully. The police pushed them out, and as we're seeing in the States, like that confrontation just blows up, and it blew up there, and so the Uyghurs, perpetuated violence toward Han shopkeepers, which they had been living very peacefully together, and then the next day, the Han had retribution toward them. The police came out in force, and they shut the whole thing down. So Xinjiang is roughly the size of Texas. It's a huge area.
It's half the size of
internet.
India. I was looking at just
it's huge, right? Yeah, it's just massive. That's a great comparison. It's a massive place.
7 UKs could fit inside Xinjiang. Yeah,
huge. Yeah. No internet. They shut the whole thing down. You couldn't make any international phone calls. Everything became like super tight. So all these Uyghur businessmen, what are they going to do? I mean, imagine you can't get on the internet. I mean, this is 2009. And so they began coming into inner China to do business, and we just began building relationships. And one thing led to another, and our business that we had started was able to help a lot of them just do normal business transactions and marketing and things like that. So we really got to know the people well. And here in America, it's like you compare it to people groups we have here. Like it always reminded me of the Mexican people around us, as far as just warm and very hospitable culture, and they could also be quick to get emotional. So they're very different than the Chinese culturally, which sometimes causes huge misunderstandings. But as far as like a people who, when you become their friends, you're a friend for life, and the type of hospitality. So, and generally a peaceful people group, so it's not like what China has made it out to be, that here is this people group that's always causing terrorism. In fact, that isn't the case for vast majorities of people. They don't have access to weapons of any kind of sort, but also, at least in my experience, they were barely Muslim in many ways, culturally Muslim for sure, but didn't even really have access to. I mean, I knew way more about the Quran than almost every Uyghur I ever met, and so some of these pressures, I do think, come from obviously a political situation, because there was so much pressure being put on them. So then, things that don't feel Chinese start to get eradicated. So huge historical sections of their historical city just being, bulldozed over, and high-rise apartment buildings put up. And you could say, well, that's just modernization, but there's so much land you could find a place to put a high-rise. It was really about control, because you can't drive tanks into these maze-like streets. And it's kind of like watching Indiana Jones, movies. It's like back in Morocco, and these little tiny alleyways, and it's what a lot of the traditional communities were like. And so these are being destroyed. Traditionally, Uyghurs had the option of learning Chinese, basically as a foreign language, or being in a Uyghur taught school, and those options are being taken away from them. Wearing the traditional head covering. So the Uyghurs wear a hat called a dopa. Well, a lot of them didn't wear them anyway, but now they're forbidden from wearing them. And so really there seems to be an attempt to not just, shut down any kind of terrorism, but really eradicate a whole culture. And that's what's, we're seeing more and more of those kind of things, taking place. We can talk about that more.
Yeah, I've got up on the screen a map of China, and yeah, I had no idea before I looked this up just how huge Xinjiang is. Yeah, half the size of India. You could fit 7 UKs into Xinjiang. I think you could fit 6 Xinjiangs into the US, but there we go. It's a sixth the size of the US, but it's half the size of India. It's absolutely huge. Sort of, we're talking about 1,000 miles, from end to end.
And it's really valuable land. It's mostly desert, surrounded by mountains and oases, but most of the rare earth minerals in the world are found there. I mean, things that we need for computers and for space exploration and oil, as well as, it's great. There's a lot of great farmland there too. Well, China has a lot of mountains, very little, they have very little farmland, and a lot of the land doesn't produce a lot of the other things that they're looking for. So it's a strategic place for China, and it's relatively unpopulated. I mean, there's about 12 million Uyghurs. I can't remember the exact population right now of Xinjiang, but let's say it would be around 20 million people, and it's a large section. And so obviously, it's somewhat comparable to, the Western states of America when, they wanted to expand, and
it's called the New Frontier, isn't it?
Here.
Yeah, it's a frontier people group. Yeah, isn't that what Xinjiang means? New frontier.
Yeah.
So,
So Xin means new, and Jiang means frontier, and so in Chinese thinking, it was always kind of the edge of China. It wasn't always controlled by China, but it was definitely the edge of their. When they had a lot of power, when the empire was strong, they controlled it. They controlled the trade routes, but they never really controlled the culture, and there never was a lot of Chinese people living there. But it was definitely strategic because that was, like some of the main nexuses of the Silk Road, and a lot of wealth, silk. Production there, jade production comes from there, grapes and melons and other things are coming through there. Plus all the trade that was coming from the Roman Empire and Europe and all throughout the Middle East was all coming through places like Kashgar and Hotan. Everything from India would come up through Hotan. So it was a very strategic place, and it still is a strategic place.
So it used to be around about like 95% Uyghur Muslims in the area, and now it's more like sort of 50% Uyghur Muslims. What's happened? The Han Chinese are moving in there in order to exploit the farmland and the mining and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, China is very overcrowded, and so they don't celebrate. With being the largest country in the world, population wise, isn't a source of pride for China. In some ways, it's a source of shame. They wish they weren't, because there's not a lot of they import millions of tons of grain a year to support their people. There's not enough farmland to feed their people, and most of the people are on the eastern coast of China, and so. Giving China the benefit of the doubt. I mean, here's a massive place that is relatively unpopulated, and it has a lot of opportunity. Plus, there's a lot of resources there. So in that sense, it makes sense. On the other side, there is this. There's been this agreement that is a semi-autonomous region that was controlled by the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and the Tajiks down in Kyrgyz peoples, these Turkic peoples and Persian peoples that have historically lived there, and so so there's that side of it. The other part of it is. There's always been this push since Mao's time to create one China. And that goes into even Chinese history and mythology. The earliest empire, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty to unite China, is kind of mythologized. So there's this desire to make China one. So instead of all these different disparate people groups and languages, because like Southern Chinese can't even communicate with Northern Chinese through speech. They've got to write it down. So the characters are the same, but the speaking is very different. So to bring it into one, how do you lead a country like that of 1 billion people? You got to make it unified. And so there's a huge effort to do that. Well, if you've got this people group on the far end of your country that don't speak the language, that have a different religion, that are really leaning more toward the West. You know, they identify with Western Muslims. They appreciate Western things. They hate Chinese things. One way to bring them in and not have them break away or have constant unrest is to overwhelm them population wise. And historically, China has always done that. They've been conquered many times, but their culture, their mass of people always seems to bring, it's like water on concrete. Eventually it wears it down. And I think bringing in, millions of Chinese people certainly changes things. And I've seen this with my eyes. In one part of one oasis, it's called Turpan. It's beautiful. It's famous for their vineyards and grapes. And you could see places where the vineyards that were historically owned by the Uyghur people were being ripped out and replaced with farmland, and the Uyghurs that lived on that land were displaced, and Chinese farmers were put on there, and they don't really interact much. So the Chinese have their own restaurants that they have their own language, they have their own way of doing things, and they really don't interact much with the Uyghur people. So I think that a huge motivation for bringing in so many people is, one, there's land there, it needs to be farmed, but also it overwhelms a culture that is seen to be undesirable to the government's ideals.
Can you tell us a bit about, well, it'd be good to hear a bit about the church in China generally, but maybe before that, just to think a bit more specifically about what's church like in Xinjiang?
There are Uyghur believers. And it sometimes it gets down to how there's different competing schools of thought about even like what should, how should Christianity look in a Muslim context? So you talk to one person anyone who has any kind of affinity towards Jesus, even if they still go to the mosque and proclaim themselves to be Muslim, well, we count them as Christians because they like Jesus too. And then there's what I would say is, the more orthodox side of it, that even evangelical expression where someone, leaves their past and follows Christ. And so that there are a handful of believers like that, hundreds of believers like that. But you're talking about a people group of 12 million. That's a very small group. And it's very hard for them to gather. So there are some Uyghur congregations, but they're spread out. They struggle because they don't have access to a lot of resources in their language. They don't have access to training readily. They tend to get pushed from both sides. So, obviously the Chinese government isn't favorable toward any kind of religion, especially anything that isn't fit within their, predetermined molds. But then you also get this cultural pressure from family and friends of, what have you done? And I've heard stories of, a number of people coming to Christ in a certain city, and they're, the people, the village gets really worked up because what's happening here? These people are not just leaving Islam. It feels like they're leaving their Uyghur culture when they follow Christ. And the government comes in and deals with it because they don't want the uprising. So, the government sometimes cares about religion. Often they just care about stability. The people themselves care about the culture and perpetuating. And I've talked to Uyghurs that say, hey, I believe what you're saying about Christ, but I don't want to abandon my Uyghurness. As if you have to choose. You can't be, in their mind, you can't be a Uyghur and be a Christian, which hasn't historically been the case, but it does. Working with Uyghurs, sharing the gospel with Uyghurs, it's a very hard thing for them to follow Christ, and it takes many, many years. And so most of the Uyghur believers don't live in that region at all anymore. And they don't have huge Uyghur churches, and only a handful of Uyghur churches that I've heard of. I've never even seen. I would say heavy persecution. There's heavy persecution just because of who they are as a people group, but then you add in the religious dynamics, and it's brutal.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about, we're hearing about these re-education camps, as the Chinese Communist Party want to call them, concentration camps, as other people are calling them. What are you hearing about these camps?
Everything I'm hearing is on the worst end of what we're seeing in the news. Even here in Northern California, there are, 1,000 or 2,000 Uyghur people that live here. Of course, if I hear about them, I try to find them, and we have, knowing that I've been there and I know their home, and even though I don't speak Uyghur, unfortunately, I speak some bad Mandarin, but we have some things in common, and I've not yet met someone that doesn't have family or friends in camps.
Wow.
And there's a huge fear of even reaching out to them. And so, students will come over here for education, or they'll go to Australia or England or Germany, Turkey. And this thing happened. And now that, it's been 3 or 4 years, and they have no idea what's going on with their mom or what's going on with their dad. And they're afraid to reach out and try to contact them, because even a phone call from the West could be enough to send them to a camp. We're hearing stories of them being, if you understand the Uyghurs too, you realize so much of what what China's saying is just absolute rubbish. I've seen it where I'll be, Uyghur guys and young women, they'll be talking about what their life is like and their experience. And when we were, in Xinjiang, and then as soon as a Han Chinese person would come up, they'd change their whole demeanor. Instead of like talking like this is the problem, this is what we need to do, this is our burden here, all of a sudden it's like, and we love, Big Brother. They would say it just like that, like super sarcastic, which most Chinese people aren't sarcastic. Uyghurs are very sarcastic in their sense of humor. And they'd be like, oh, we love Big Brother. We're so grateful, for China's, educating us and giving us all these, we were a primitive people and now we're, an advanced people, and it kind of like talking like this. And so when you see the news of like, all these Uyghurs lining up and, chanting the praises, of China, this isn't true. And being forced to leave their homeland, which they love their home. And they're very passionate about their oasis. And if you ever talk to one, like, there'll be fights about, is Kashgar better than Ely? And like, those guys are this way, and they're very passionate about their home, and it's a very beautiful place. And so you're seeing these things and you realize, okay, this is terrible. And even before the internment camps, you would hear stories of from even my friends of being tortured and huge, they'd get something sent to them on the internet, a video of something that happened, and within minutes the police are at their door. I've experienced that, just staying in a home, and we thought we were doing everything right. In the middle of the night, the police come in and they interview you. What are you doing here? Like, I'm spending the night at my friend's house. It's something that those of us in the West really can't fathom, because if I came and visited you, I would not expect at midnight the police to barge in. But it's kind of expected that there's going to be police intrusion, even if you're in, the middle of nowhere. So, over 1 million Uyghurs are in internment camps right now. And the attempt is to eradicate a whole people group. And I really believe that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to eradicate a language so that they're not unique in that way, eradicate their identity as a people group. I think religion actually is kind of like a tertiary concern, as they do allow religion as long as it goes along with the party line. So there's official mosques, official churches, official synagogues, but they're going to be very sinicized, cleaned up and made to look like what the central government wants it to look like.
Some people are calling this. Go on, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say, I'd be really interested to know what how is it being reported where you are? Because the thing that I found interesting, I think we talked about it last week, was that for us, we heard about this story sometime in the middle of last year, maybe later in the year, but but it didn't really seem to get picked up. A few news places have picked it up. As I've looked around, most of the articles I find about this are from last year, and it seems that a lot of news outlets have picked it up. But the thing that I found interesting was that nobody seemed to be talking about it. It didn't really seem, nobody kind of grabbed it and went, oh my goodness, this is awful. And I'm just wondering what side you're seeing of it over in the States, and if you've got any thoughts on perhaps why that's the case and maybe why it's resurfaced a bit now as well.
Yeah, in some ways I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm searching it out and I care a lot about it. And so the New York Times and The Economist are the two news organizations that I feel like have always been on top of this. And then lately we were seeing, more news outlets picking it up. Vice just did a series where people went undercover, and really, I mean, it's heartbreaking videos. It's heartbreaking for anyone to watch. It's really heartbreaking for me to watch because I'm like, I know those streets. I know those places. They don't look anything like what they looked like even just a few years ago. And so it's starting to get some traction. There's a lot of anti-China sentiment in America right now. I mean, certainly Donald Trump, has been banging that drum. I mean, that he's their, he's the favorite target. They're his favorite target. But I think there's a couple factors that work against the Uyghur people. They don't have a warm and cuddly spokesperson. Like the Dalai Lama for Tibet, for instance. Who is that person that's speaking out for them that people can identify with and go, okay, that's someone that I can identify with. That's horrible. The other part of it is that I think there's an anti-Muslim bias. So, I mean, certainly I'm a Christian. I don't agree with Islam and I want Muslims to know Jesus. But there is this bias that every Muslim is a terrorist, which is just, blatantly untrue. And those who live in multicultural areas, most of the UK is very multicultural. You know this, living out in the Bay Area, we have Muslims in our home very frequently, and it's not any kind of special thing. They're just hanging out with my kids because they're friends at school, and so you understand that. So, when China says, well, they're terrorists, it's just assumed after 9/11 that they probably are. Well, China's got ulterior motives, and only recently are people calling them out on it. And so there has been some movement. In fact, a lot of the Uyghurs, here in the States even in China that I met, really liked, America because they felt like America is a country that kind of, at least says something about their rights. I kind of worry that a lot of times it's just talk, because the only way to make China move on anything is financially. So if you stop buying their products, if you stop buying Uyghur-made products, if you stop, buying cars that are made with labor that is probably, Uyghur slave labor, that would impact China's bottom line. And even culturally, Americans, Australians are definitely this way, are very upfront and kind of in your face and direct. And Chinese that's shameful, and they're not going to respond well to bullying, but they will respond to the bottom line. And so, I would love to see, something being done that would put a lot of pressure on China, but at this point it's out of the bag, and I have a hard time seeing them walking this back. I really don't see a good ending. I don't know I can't envision what a good end could look like here, unless there's a major shift in the political landscape. And that could happen because the previous chairman was a lot more open than the current chairman of China. So that could happen. But in America, I think there's some interest, but attention spans are short. Right now, everyone's thinking about COVID. Then they're thinking about the riots. And the race issues here in America, and then they're going to be thinking about the election and the amount of attention that they can give toward any kind of Uyghur concern is small, unfortunately. And it's heartbreaking for someone that loves that people and wants to see this gain major traction, but I think it is what it is.
Can you give us a sense?
What's it like in the UK? I would love to hear that if you want to share that.
Yeah,
Australia, because there's a lot of Uyghurs in Australia.
Right, right. Well, I mean, as you talk about Australians being a bit more in your face, and I think Australian politicians have been a bit more in China's face, and I think, yeah, that hasn't always led to the warmest diplomacy. But maybe talking tough, needs to happen. I don't know, but I think here in the UK, there's just been a petition signed by 100,000 people, which is the threshold at which Parliament has to debate a certain topic, and the topic of the petition was that we should have sanctions against China because of its treatment of Uyghur Muslims. And I think it's pretty much a copycat of the bill that Marco Rubio, is that right? That he he sponsored that bill in Congress. So again, like you say, trying to hit China where it hurts in the bottom line. But I'd be fascinated to know about boycotting certain products. I don't know which products I would boycott. Are there websites we can go to? What can we do? This would be really good to figure out, Scott. What can we actually do?
Yeah, as far as boycotting, I mean, I want to be very careful with that. I mean, one, I don't even know if it's effective or not, and two, there's so much bad information that I want to be careful. So I'm not going to say. I think you could probably go online and research that, and I'll continue to do that. I think certainly the government can know. I mean, we can pressure our government officials to take this seriously and to understand that it's seriously, and as well as I think just even on social media, helping to raise those voices and helping people to see. Because when I've been to the Holocaust Museum both in DC but also in Israel, and you realize like how complicit the Western countries were, like we just didn't care, and we have something very similar to this. And I don't know if there's mass exterminations taking place, but it's something horrendous in our lifetime that's taking place, and we can push our leaders to think about this. And in America, we can write our Congress people, and I'm sure you can email or write your MPs and pressure them about this issue, that they know that. And I think Uyghur Muslims are watching, and they're seeing who's standing up for them. I've seen multiple posts of like, where are the Muslims? Why, China's giving these Muslim nations massive amounts of money. Pretty much anyone that the UK and Australia and America boycott or put sanctions on, China's right there to pick up the slack and make friends with. Well, putting pressure on these places to not to do that. But anyway, Muslims are seeing that the Muslim nations in general aren't speaking up about this and aren't standing up for them. Well, that kind of goes against the whole, projected ethos of Islam, that there's this giant ummah and we're all part of this great family and we take care of each other. And they do see, and they do notice that the people who are caring about them and fighting for them tend to be Christians. And I think they notice that. So, I mean, making things aware on social media, pushing that, seeking out Uyghur restaurants, which they're not usually well known, and then asking questions, and understanding they're going to be cautious. And a lot of times they'll have Chinese patrons there, and they're not going to talk about these issues in front of Chinese patrons for fear of retribution back home. But you can, if you tell them, hey, I was reading about, and you have to be careful. And you have to make a decision if you want to use this language or not. Most of the Uyghurs of living abroad refer to Xinjiang, not as Xinjiang, because that's a Chinese idea and Chinese thought, but they call it East Turkestan. And so that's kind of they want that to be their own nation. And so you see like the blue flag with, kind of the crescent and the star, the light blue flag, and talk about East Turkestan. And if you drop that term and say, I've been reading a lot about East Turkestan and about the different cities, Hotan and Kashgar, where are your family from? And if you do a little bit of reading and know about a few of the things that are there and a little bit of the history, and immediately you'll find a warm reception. And, it's like if you're from a small town and someone from England, I'm from a small town in Wisconsin and someone from England's been there. I'm just shocked, let's talk. We have something in common. And kind of just begin to show care for them. Leave larger tips than, well, I don't know if you tip in England or not, but in America, my tips are ridiculous because like I want them to know that I feel for their situation and I care about them as people and just start to build those kind of relationships and letting them know that they're not invisible, they're being seen. I will tell them I'm praying for them, and tell them can I pray for your family? They do respect faith and they do have an appreciation for that. And I think those are the kinds of things that over time build relationships. For Christians, we have to understand that, they're not going to change overnight in their understanding of Christianity. It's going to take many, many years of hearing the truth of the gospel and watching it being lived out. And, I've had Muslim friends say, I've never had a friend treat me like you treat me. And I'm like, oh, I'm sure you do the same thing for me. And he looked at me and the guy goes, no, I wouldn't. And he's not a believer. He didn't become a believer, but I feel like sometimes our testimony and the way we love and care for them is showing them that Christ is real in our lives. So that would be my encouragement, to seek them out and then to support them where they're at, find out their needs, find out the names, ask them if you can pray for their family. You're not going to recognize the names. They're hard to pronounce. And so you ask them to write it down, those kind of things, learn a couple Uyghur words. Most places that could be kind of seen as strange, but especially a people group that feels like they're on the verge of eradication. Those things, those gestures mean a lot.
Scott, just as we finish, can you just raise our gaze a little bit to what do you think God might be up to in China? We hear all sorts of reports, and I don't know what kind of numbers to trust in terms of what the underground church is like. But what do you feel God might be doing in China? And who knows, maybe the 21st century will belong to China. Maybe this really is a time in which China will be a giant on the world stage. Is there a sort of a secret giant in the midst of China itself? What's going on spiritually, do you think, in the country as a whole?
I had a good friend, an old China hand, as they say, that said, everything you hear about China is true somewhere in China. And I found that to be true in my own experience. By some estimates, there's 97 million Chinese Christians. It's a small percentage of the Chinese population, but that's a large number, right? And it's getting pretty close to the number of evangelical believers in America. And I would say, though, that the Chinese church is sometimes a mile wide and an inch deep. But there are some strong churches and strong believers. There is a mission impulse to reach those people with the gospel. And I do wonder sometimes if this current unrest, there is a lot of pressure on Chinese churches as well. That's increased since 2011. It's gotten a lot more intense, especially in interior China. So you'll have a little bit more freedom and opening in like Shanghai or Beijing, but you'll have a lot more harsh measures in Xi'an or Chengdu or some of these inner cities. And I wonder if some of the pressure will bring, because Chinese Christians struggle just like American or English Christians or Australian Christians do, I'm sure, with racism and ethnocentrism, and I think some of these issues may cause them to become aware of some of the needs around them. Most of the Chinese believers I know were very afraid of Uyghur people, and they read the state media and believe in all of it. And the only Uyghurs they ever saw were the beggars and the thieves on the corner. And so, being able to maybe see them from a different light could be really, a helpful thing. And I think we've seen in China in the past that what I'm hoping will happen with the Uyghurs, and that God will take this horrific circumstance and turn it to good by realizing there is no hope in Islam, but also that having a lot of their foundations being ripped up will cause them to think about God in ways they haven't. Kind of like what COVID's doing. I feel like COVID's causing people to think about eternity. Every time they see another death total, they're like, I might die. And when things are made uncomfortable, you start thinking about eternal things. And so I'm just praying that that's what God will do here, and that even with the spreading of Uyghur people and the spreading of Chinese people around the world, that there'll be a turning to Christ. But I don't know. I hope so.
Right.
I guess those are kind of good things for us to be praying for. Then off the back of that, that actually God is moving. I think it's easy for us to look at these things, isn't it? And to just despair a bit. But I think, as we read through the Bible, we see time and time again, there have been situations where things have looked hopeless. But God has been at work in things in ways at the time people couldn't possibly have really known or been aware of. And, I'm sure God works in that way now. So, like you say, we've been talking about COVID here as a church, and saying, of course, maybe this is a time where people, like you say, do start to realize their mortality and go, well, what's life about? Everything's been stripped away that I would normally do in my life. And it does open those questions. And maybe in the same way as people begin to see these things going on in China, that may cause questions, but also we pray that it will be an opportunity for, like the Uyghur community as well, like you say, to find Christ, and for the church in China to be a witness in some way, whatever that might look like. And who knows? I was reading a book the other day that said, I don't know exactly where the figures came from, but if the church in China continued to grow in the way it is, by 2050, it would be a majority Christian country. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen between now and then, but it strikes me that would be a huge turnaround for a nation like China, given what it looks like at the moment. And
And I would, challenge those who are thinking about missions, and maybe they're listening to this and be like, I have a burden for the Uyghurs. I want to reach them with the gospel, and it seems hopeless. In recognizing it takes years and years of preparation, because Mandarin is the language of commerce, but Uyghur is their heart language, and neither of those languages are an easy language for an native English speaking person to learn. And it may mean that, instead of going to Xinjiang, we go to places like Turkey, or we go to places like Australia, or Germany, which are three places where I always am hearing Uyghurs trying to go to. They'd love to come to America too, and England too, but those are, Australia's closer, and for a while they were giving a lot of educational visas. Turkey, of course, is a very similar language, and it's obviously a much more modern country than some of the other Turkic countries. And going there and preparing by learning the language there and building relationships in those places with diaspora peoples. Sometimes when people's lives are uprooted, they're eager and willing to hear and think about things that they wouldn't think about if they're surrounded by, their tradition and their peers. And so now is not the time, I think, for Christians to hold back, because it's an uncertain time. I think we really need to lean in to this moment and see what God's going to do, because we don't know in China when things open and when they close. Right now, it's a pretty closed window for that, but it will open again, and we should be preparing for that time. And it's not going to be like, oh, it's open and now it's going to be immediate fruit. It's about 7 years of language prep and cultural prep, and there's just so many things that even in my short time I did wrong, just because I didn't understand the culture and didn't understand, the way Eastern cultures think and work and process things. And I caused needless offense because I didn't know what I was doing and talking about, where we can start working on those things even now and preparing ourselves now.
Mm. And a great way that people can prepare themselves, why don't you subscribe to the Missions Podcast, which Scott is a co-host of, and those guys are always talking about these kinds of issues, and perhaps it will stir up many to either consider going themselves or supporting the work of missions in whatever way is possible. So I highly recommend the Missions Podcast. Get that from your local podcatcher. But Scott Dunford, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It's been really eye-opening, and I pray that it stirs us all towards further prayer and towards considering how God might be using us in reaching the nations. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a joy talking to you guys.
It's been great.